Thank you. So welcome to our webinar today, and thank you so much for joining us. You can leave questions throughout in the chat, and we should have some time to get to those at the end. And without further ado, I will introduce our speaker today. Othman Al-Talib is Merassier's Chief Growth Officer. He joined in July of 2022 and has a really exciting discussion to share with us today on disrupting the research lifecycle. So Othman, over to you.
Thank you, Sam, and welcome to everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy days to join us around a really exciting topic, one that I really enjoy kind of reading up on and also learning how from the lessons of the past to see how we can shape the future, which I think is really exciting for many of you as attendees that work directly in the space of impacting our societies for the future. So let's jump right into it. So from I always like to just set the framework for for any discussion like this by talking about mindsets, and the reason for that is because the quintessential reason behind transformation really starts with the transformation of the self, right? And we can't change what's around us if we haven't changed what's within us first, and that really starts kind of up here, and it starts with how we think about things. So Carol Dweck, who's professor at Stanford, wrote a seminal book about mindsets, and one of the mindsets that she describes in detail is something called a fixed mindset. And so a fixed mindset focuses and looks at failure as a limiting factor to their capabilities. A person with a fixed mindset doesn't like to be challenged. They like to just continue to go down the same process that they're used to, the routines that they're used to. And the moment they hit obstacles, it's a massive struggle for them. They like to stick to what they know. They take feedback and criticism in a personal way because they see it as an attack on their capabilities, and they see it as an attack on who they are and their identity. And when they get frustrated, they give up. So that's the first mindset. Another mindset that Professor Dweck describes is a growth mindset. And a growth mindset actually looks at failure as an opportunity for growing, right? It looks at failure as being a learning to say, okay, now I know what not to do. Next thing is figuring out, okay, what else can I do? And through that process of iteration, growth happens. This person with a growth mindset sees challenges as an opportunity to grow as well. They like feedback and they enjoy it because it's something that gives them a constructive way and reasons behind why they can continue to adapt. They're inspired by the success of others. They see the success of individuals and companies and institutions as something to look to and learn from, rather than seeing their own fallacies or their own limitations, and they love to learn new things. So for the rest of this session, I really want us to not be in a fixed mindset, and actually to, after the session, to have a difficult conversation with ourselves and say, where do I line up in regards to many of these statements? Am I someone that falls more in the fixed mindset realm, or do I really fall into the growth mindset? And that honest conversation needs to happen for us to see transformation in ourselves, and also to see transformation in all of the areas that we work in and live in and enjoy being around. So that's kind of to set the framework for us. Now, the next theory that I want to discuss, which is really important when we talk about disruption, which is another seminal work in the scholarly space by Clayton Christensen, is disruptive innovation. And disruptive innovation, and I want us to kind of, I'm giving some of these theories as just a baseline for us to evolve from and to continue to extrapolate on, but I don't want to lock us into these theories. But the first thing with disruptive innovation is the concept of, many companies, and this is how, Professor Christensen frames it, is that it's focused on companies, right? So there's large established companies and institutions and societies that through their success, they've needed to incrementally improve their offering to their consumers, right? But because they've reached a certain level of success, it's very difficult to make radical changes to their offerings, radical changes to their processes. And so one of these, the concept of disruptive innovation is that if you stop at a low risk, low reward, incremental innovation, the next stage of innovation starts to creep up on you, which is other companies, other societies, other institutions may start to now produce new products or new processes that replace the old ones or the existing ones. And this starts to become a competition at varying levels of the market. And so it takes you one step closer to, it's a higher risk to invest in these types of innovations. These could be technological innovations, these could be process-oriented innovations, these could be business model innovations, but the reward is much more than the incremental innovation. And then you finally get to disruptive innovation. And this is something that really, within the framework that Professor Christensen lays out, is an area that's highly neglected, right? There's a market of consumers that is either underrepresented, underfilled, or there's just complete neglect. There's non-consumption happening in a space that a disruptive innovation comes at an extremely low cost that starts to garner traction from within that market. And that's where you see a uptick in the ability of competing with these bigger societies. So these smaller companies, these smaller societies, these smaller institutions start to move away from what we call sustaining innovations, right? Just keep the lights on, incremental of a couple % growth every year. We just want to give you a few additional features to help you with your process. Those sustaining innovations have a lower linear, a more incremental linear growth, and the customer demand for new technology also grows at that same rate. And the disruptive innovation just starts to plow through all of that. And if you see the gap between the beginning of the access and where you see disruptive innovations, there's a lag time there, and the lag time there is really the building up of those underrepresented, those forgotten either researchers or consumers that over time this disruptive innovation builds them to reach a critical mass that then starts to compete with the bigger players and the established players. So this is something to just kind of keep in mind as we go through this session, is to think about these in terms of ourselves and what we see around us. And so if we go to the next one, let's just kind of put it in more layman terms. You have the status quo, you have those institutions that dominate the market. Those institutions then get consumer dissatisfaction starting to happen because the incremental changes with how the world is evolving is just not enough to keep up with all the advancements in expectations. And so that's where the disruptor identifies that gap, and they create an innovation that fills that gap for those consumers. And then now the consumer has a choice between going with the established player that's been around for a long time, but they're only giving them incremental gains in the longer term, or do I go with this new player that came into the market and actually is giving me something that's completely different and can help me scale much faster? And this is where you start to get into an adaptation, right? So either the established player starts to adapt and learn from that disruptive innovation. And really, this is kind of where that innovator's dilemma starts to happen, because if you wait too long to invest in that disruptive innovation because you're so focused on the sustaining innovations, you may lose the opportunity to meet those consumer needs, and adaptation becomes much more difficult. And so this is kind of how we're going to go through the rest of the session. If you remember these concepts, it'll help kind of shape some of the conversation that we have, and challenge ourselves to think about our areas of expertise in a different way. So moving on, we all remember this, right? We all remember when we had to go outside in any given weather and stand in long queues and long lines and wait for the next taxi cab that would take us from point A to point B, right? It was a very simple objective that we had. And next thing you know, you can actually be sitting on your couch or in your house and scheduling the same thing, right? And so disruptive innovation is saying, how do I break down the objective of a process, which is I need to get into a car that will take me from point A to point B. How that's done doesn't matter, as long as it's more convenient for the consumer. And so we saw what Uber and Lyft did to the transportation industry, and now they've kind of expanded into the food delivery industry as well. But it started like this shift. We also see another example of this, where we would go into emergency rooms, we would go into urgent cares, we'd go into clinics, and they would be filled with people. And this, of course, led to additional struggle on the person who's ill. It either led to other illnesses being spread as well, and just complete exhaustion and inefficiency. And so now in today's world, what we see is you could just sit at home and communicate directly with a physician, where you don't have to leave your home. You don't have to go into those discomforts of getting into a car and going to a clinic. Another innovation that all of us, in the US, for the most part, remember, but even globally, if you think about it, when you used to go to film stores and you'd walk around each aisle trying to pick out which movie you want to watch for that night, this was something that also, if you take the objective, I just want to be able to watch I just want to be able to pick what I watch in a convenient way. You now have kind of this new innovation that came out to say, you know what, you can stay at home and have everything that you would have traveled outside for at your fingertips. And so we as consumers on a daily basis are confronted with all of these changes in the last few years. And we see these shifts in our lives as everyday consumers. And so the question starts to become, why don't we see this, after all, right? Amazon and why don't we see these disruptions in our day-to-day activities at work? And so here's what you kind of see is that the problems that we see around us being solved with technology and with innovation, what else can we improve, right? And so I want to take us through a journey of something that's a bit closer to the scholarly communication space, the scientific research space, where you can see either you're the disruptor or you're the one being disrupted. And so we'll go through a couple examples just to land it. So 77% of students believe that online learning could be just as effective as in-person learning. So let's remember these days where we used to sit in large seminar rooms and listen to the professor presenting a presentation, where today you have the ability to, again, sit in front of your computer in the comfort of your own home and learn the same pieces of knowledge with, of course, there's always arguments about what the benefits of hybrid versus fully virtual can be. But these are the changes that we start to see coming into the academic and the learning space. The next one is, 60% of scientists start their search process on Google Scholar. Now let's remember back to what we used to do when we had to go to these individual card catalogs and find what the numbers are, the codes are for the books, and we would go and walk the aisles and try to find that. Whereas now you can just sit on your laptop or your computer and search for the keywords of of the title of a study, and it will pull up everything that's related to that. And so these are new conveniences that we found. We also see that 70% of researchers believe that all of research outputs should be openly accessible. And so we have kind of the old way that we used to find research and output and scientific output, going into the libraries and physically needing to have subscriptions or memberships to these libraries, whereas now you could actually just view them online, right? You can view them on any given mode of learning, right? So tablets and laptops and phones, you can have it in your pocket throughout the day. And so these are the advancements that we see in our industry today, right? Let alone kind of the ones that we see as just normal consumers. And so when we talk about disrupting the publishing workflow, I think it's important to step back and ask ourselves, similar to the Uber example, similar to the Netflix example, similar to our ability to just get on our phones and search something and walk towards that. We got to ask ourselves, what's the base level objective of our publishing workflows? And a big portion of that really is is being able to filter out science that's not actual science. It's either fraudulent, it's either poor quality, it's not worthy of being published and having other knowledge built upon it. And you saw the image before this, where this still happens, around the world, where you have scientists, you have researchers that are sitting in rooms and going through actual papers of proposals, of abstracts, of actual papers to get published, where they have to read through them. And so what do we see? What's kind of, when we understand that the objective of the publication process and the peer review process is actually to filter out all of the things that are not worthy of being published as science, then we can get down to a base level, like a base level process of what that means. And this is why researchers are desperate for disruption in peer review, because, over the years, we start to build complexity because we have many findings that we identify to say, hey, this is a gap, that we've published something that may not have been accurate research. So now let's build a process to protect us from doing that in the future. And over decades and decades, those processes start to compound, and it really makes the peer review process extremely slow. So if we go to the next slide, you see, this is kind of the reality that we're confronted with today, where over the last 10 years, we've only increased our time of how long it takes to actually review a piece of science, right? And output for publication. Over time, usually you see that efficiencies and technology help you drop how long it takes you to achieve your objectives. But in our industry, we've seen it grow. And here's another beautiful example of what many people still go through today. But this stat really was astounding for me, where globally in 2020 alone, it took 15,000 years for all of the peer reviews to be reviewed, right? So imagine how much time by every single scientist and researcher was spent to just make it through the process that we've created in order to filter out bad science from good science and get that published. And so that brings us to now what the outcome of that is, right? For the consumer, for the researcher, is that they start to reject. They don't have time. 2/3 of researchers that are sent peer review requests from editorial teams reject them, because it's just become a very cumbersome process. And every one of you who actually works with peer reviewers, you have that struggle every single day. How do I get more peer reviewers to accept? How do I build my pool of peer reviewers? And the problem sometimes is not about just identifying the peer reviewer. It's actually saying, is the peer reviewer willing to go through the pain of the peer review process, because our technology, because our model is something that has just continued to grow in complexity over time. And so, why would we disrupt the publishing workflow? One of the main reasons is that we create efficiencies, right? And those the creation of that efficiency is through the optimization, the automation, the intelligent workflow that can streamline all of the compoundment of years and years of complexity that's been built, to streamline it, and then infuse into that streamlined process quality checks, right? Things that, as technology continues to advance, and we've all seen, what's happening with ChatGPT, we all see what's happening with AI and machine learning, and what are those capabilities that we can start to pull from and say, how do we infuse that into our overall workflow in order to protect and remove some of the barriers of entry that we've created through processes, because we didn't have this technology in the past. And so this is how you start to create interoperable tools for integrity checks and so on. And all of this kind of leads to the improvement and the growth of value that we bring to society. The more time, if you're not spending 15,000 years in a process, but you're actually spending 15,000 years in producing science and knowledge at a high quality, at a low cost, very efficiently, then we reach our objective, which is creating impact, right? We are creating civilizational and societal impact. And that's the ultimate objective, is that the moment that we strip away all of the things that we've created as institutions, as companies, as publishers, as researchers, when we strip away some of that and say, okay, well, how can I now rethink with a growth mindset? How can I rethink making this process that takes me from point A to point B with the objectives that I have? How do I bring it to the baseline level so that I can increase my impact on the world? And this is where disruption comes from. And so the benefits of that is kind of exactly what we're talking through now, right? So if we didn't have to spend 15,000 years publishing, then we save researchers 150,000 hours each year with an optimized publishing workflow, right? And that, imagine the work that can be done when we remove some of these complexities from that process and actually have the researchers focus on the research itself, focus on the science itself. Is it good science? Is it bad science? And how do we filter that out? We also, the ones that benefit is actually the public, right? And that's through the quality that we get. Every single retraction on average costs over $400,000. Imagine the increase in retraction over the number of years. If you just look at the past 30 years, the number of retractions has exponentially grown. And that's money that's affected by the investment in research itself, by the grant funding that's going into that research, and also the research that's built upon research. And so improving these checks where it doesn't need to be manual in many cases, but actually something that can be automated within the workflow itself and strip away some of the processes that we've created to protect against that, the amount of money and the amount of impact that can now be reinvested into the actual work of science is extremely important. And then finally, when we see all of the lives that get impacted by the work that is being done by every single society in the different fields, this is where we start to now really invest our time in the actual research itself and how to fund that research, and not spending our times in entering our institution data, in entering our metadata, in doing manual entry throughout multiple systems that we're entering, but rather allow the technology to work for us so that we can spend better time, maybe additional 5 minutes with your kids before you need to jump into a taxi, that you otherwise would not have had if you had to stand in a line, right? But now that we can schedule the transportation to an airport, you could spend an additional 30 minutes with your kids, with your family. And so these are the things that we kind of think about, that we see as consumers, that we can translate into our day-to-day lives, right? The work that we do on a regular basis. And so with that, hopefully it was thought-provoking, and the more exciting part is really the question and answer, and really hearing from all of you on your thoughts and what you see happening around the industry when it comes to disruptive innovation.
Thank you so much, Othman. I think that was great. I'm gonna pull open the chat. Feel free to write any questions in there or in the Q&A tab, but I also have a few questions that we've received during the registration process for you, so we can kick off with those. The first one is sort of a favorite question of mine to ask as people join the scholarly publishing industry, and that's kind of, when you first joined Mercier and first joined this industry, what was something that surprised you about it, and that took you for a loop a little bit?
Yeah, excellent question. To be honest, I never actually looked or maybe understood, even though I would, I've done a master's degree. I've gone through the research process and looking up different papers and articles, and I had to go through JSTOR and all these things. I actually never expected how all of this research actually emanates from the society and society publisher world, right? And how it impacts every sector of our lives, right? And I think about, you have societies that are focused on engineering and all of the publications and science that's created through that. You have societies that are focused on physics, and they're focused on medical and all of the science that is constantly being published through the millions of conferences and ideas being exchanged and built upon. I just didn't know how pervasive it was in our society until I kind of looked under the hood a bit and saw, like, wow, I didn't know that this, this thing that I'm seeing in my normal life, actually the inception of it was from a conference that happened, in this city in this year, right? That was put on by this society. So that was a bit shocking to me, to just see like the tentacles of research and the impact of research happening around us that I was never aware of, being from the outside. So that's also the exciting part, I think, for the future as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, this is a great question. So we've talked a lot about technology-focused innovation. So what do you think about innovations in either peer review or publishing workflows more broadly that are less about technology and more about process and even culture, such as the 450 movement that advocates for paying peer reviewers for their work, something that doesn't happen consistently now?
Yeah, great question. And I was just having a conversation also with somebody who's been in this industry for a long time, and one of the arguments is saying that behavior is much harder to change than technology, right? And the argument that I would make is it's kind of a chicken and egg type argument, where is it that the technology that's introduced fundamentally changes the behavior of people, or is it that behavior had already started to change and technology then came and just facilitated it? And I just kind of think back to some of the examples that we mentioned at just a consumer level, right? Us as normal people outside of our workday, we used to invest a lot of time going places, right? And we used to invest, like, logistically, we used to do a lot of things in order for us to just achieve an objective of either getting food, picking something up, going in and actually choosing certain things, where as technology started to be introduced into those different parts of our lives, I feel our behavior has changed too, right? I was always one of those people that I need to go to the grocery store because I need to make sure that the grapes that I buy are not the squishy grapes, but they're hard because I like to bite into them, right? But that behavior has completely got eroded because the amount of time I would take to get into the car, drive to the grocery store, go into the store itself, and walk around the aisles, and then actually, find the right produce. It's not worth my time. So I've given up kind of some of the preferences that I had, and the behavioral preference that I had in doing that, because the technology now made it easy where I could just order it. And yeah, maybe the person that's picking up the grocery order for me doesn't put the same love into picking the items, but I'm okay with that because it saves me an hour trip, right? It saves me taking my 3 boys into the car and needing to then take them down and put them into the carts and walk down the aisle, and then they spill something and it's like, no. So I do believe a lot of our processes were either built because we did not have the right technology to help us solve the problem that we were trying to solve. And so that means we had to build more approval processes, right? Approval processes are one of the more inefficient because they add no true value to our value stream. And so every time you put an approval process or a checkpoint or a decision-making step somewhere into your process, it sucks time, right? And it slows you down from achieving the end-to-end goal that you have. But many times we have to do that because there are checks that need to be made. And if we don't make them, actually the end result of that product or that process could cause me much more pain than just taking an additional 5 minutes or hour or day or 10 days to do this one step. So now the question becomes, so can technology actually achieve that step at a higher quality than we can in an automated fashion, right? And that's really the challenge that I think we in the publishing industry, in the scholarly industry, really need to challenge ourselves with, to say, well, what is my baseline objective? And what have I built on top of that? All of that complexity that I've built on top of it, which pieces of that are really necessary for me to achieve my objective and my outcome? And which of them did I create because there were inefficient things around me? There was a lack of technology around me. There was a lack of integrations with tools that are able to do certain things that even me manually could not have achieved. And so I think that's where, when we challenge ourselves with that thinking, and we kind of take that step back from what's regulatory, what's policy, what's morally or ethically correct, and build that into the baseline expectation, everything else on top of that becomes negotiable. Everything on top of that becomes expendable. And I think that's the same thing with paying peer reviewers, right? We saw 2/3 of peer reviewers. Now, again, there could be many reasons underneath that let's not oversimplify this, but 2/3 of peer reviewers, when requested to do a peer review, are saying no, because the ultimate reward that they get in kind of this world is seeing that they've contributed to science, the impact on the scientific world, making sure that they filtered out something that could have caused so much harm. And so there's an innate moral and ethical value that's attributed to that. The question then becomes, well, are there ways for us to get more of that science and the right science out the door if we had more research, more reviewers willing to review in a streamlined process that doesn't take time, and they get rewarded through different mechanisms? And I think that's where the challenge from an industry perspective is, just the conversation. What does that look like? Where are the lines of morality and ethics? Where do they kind of hold us within a certain paradigm? And within that paradigm, then what is negotiable? What is movable? And I think that's the conversation I would love to hear more about in this industry as I spend more time in it. But excellent
Yeah.
question, Sam, and very long-winded answer. So
No, it's great. I think we have about 5 minutes left. So I've got one last question, which is one of my own actually, because I think this one is really interesting to me as we look at various industries right now. We see all these major disruptors of the past decade, like Netflix or even Uber, that are now sort of struggling financially, or they're not sort of seeing the same return that they saw in that original point of that disruptive innovation. So can we talk about this as a model for long-term success and how we build that sort of long-term planning and innovation into the process?
yeah, absolutely. This is the beauty of um, not being in a finite game, right? Simon Sinek talks about the finite game versus the infinite game, and this is where that one slide that we had that had status quo and it took us through the process. It was a flywheel, right? It was a cycle. It wasn't just a linear line that stopped at a certain place, right? The disruptor can become the disrupted at any point in time, right? And that is the continuous challenge that we have to continue to innovate. That's the beauty of innovation. Once you get disrupted, that doesn't mean that you're out of the game, right? If you are willing to put in the necessary resources, whether intellectually, whether financially, whether just from a perspective of finding what the next innovative horizon could be for your industry and putting the consumer at the forefront, right? And in our case, the researcher at the forefront, then you will find times where you are the disruptor, and then you will find times where you're being challenged by another disruptor. And one of the key cases that we're seeing play out in front of us today was what Google did to Yahoo and Microsoft, right? In kind of the last 20 years, there was a massive disruption that happened to Microsoft and Yahoo when it came to search, when it came to different capabilities with Microsoft Office and what you use with Chrome. And so there was disruption, right, that Google had. And we knew that Google was at the top when it came to AI and artificial intelligence innovative practices. And it was something that fed into all of their products. But what we're seeing play out before us today is that Microsoft, who was the disrupted at a certain point, is now coming back around that loop and now is starting to do the disrupting themselves. And you're seeing kind of how Chat GPT versus, Bard, how that competitive edge, that battle that starts to happen is so intriguing for society, because now it challenges both players to up their level, right? And start to make different investments and different intellectual and strategic calibrations to make sure that they're not left behind in this infinite race of societal improvement. And so I think that's to answer your question in a concise way. I think it's changing the mindset to, hey, we have a finite goal and we need to achieve our quarterly earnings, or we need to achieve our annual earnings, or we need to achieve this financial goal within this time frame. If we abstract out of that a bit and say, if I have a longer time horizon to this, where this is an infinite game and I'm going to be a constant battle with myself and the market and how to satisfy my consumer, right? How do I satisfy my constituents? You will then find yourself in this battle where disruption actually becomes part of your DNA, right? You're either the one doing the disrupting, and at some point you're going to be disrupted, and then you go back into the mindset of, okay, now I need to do the disrupting myself, and it just becomes a loop of innovation. And the only winners in that is everybody, right? The time that you have a loser is when somebody has that fixed mindset and says, you know what, I give up. This is too much of a challenge. I can't make those investments, or we view things in a very finite way. So it's actually, to me, it's an exciting experience that we're also witnessing today in the technology industry that I think is at the heart of what we can do in the research publication industry as well, and the scholarly research industry as well.
Yeah, absolutely. They say the rising tide lifts all boats, and that's what we see with this. That brings us to our time today. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining and for questions. Please always feel free to reach out to us on Twitter or LinkedIn with additional questions, and the recording of this will be shared with you all shortly. So thank you so much, and thank you to Othman.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Should I stop the recording?
Yes, I think so.